The mission bell tolled 3 times, each bronze note hanging in the desert air like a judgment passed down from heaven itself. Sister Catherine Martinez pressed her face against the rough adobe wall, her cheek scraping against the sun-baked clay as she tried to make herself smaller, invisible, anything but what she was in that moment, a woman whose tongue had betrayed her again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The courtyard of San Miguel Mission stretched before her like a stage where only tragedies were performed. Dust devils spun lazy circles between the chapel and the dormitories, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something that smelled like fear mixed with dried blood. The other sisters moved like ghosts in their gray habits, heads down, hands folded, speaking only in whispers of Latin and carefully pronounced English, never Spanish, never Apache, never the languages that lived in their bones like buried rivers. Catherine's back still burned from yesterday's lashing. 10 strikes with a leather strap, each one a lesson in proper Christian conduct, each one a reminder that her voice, when it carried the ancient words of her grandmother's people, was the voice of the devil himself. Or so Father McKinnon had explained while the strap came down again and again, painting red lines across her shoulders like some twisted form of Holy Scripture. She hadn't meant to speak Apache. It had simply poured out of her when little Maria Santos had fallen from the bell tower ladder, her small body crumpled in the dirt, blood pooling beneath her head like spilled wine. The healing words had come without thought, without permission, rising from some deep place inside Catherine where memory lived like buried treasure. Ancient words, powerful words, words that had once called spirits back from the edge of death. But here, in this place where salvation came wrapped in iron discipline and English prayers, those words were blasphemy. Maria had lived the gash. On her head had closed, the terrible stillness had left her limbs, but Catherine had paid the price for that miracle. The strap, the shame, the reminder that she was here to be remade, not to remember. Catherine Martinez had not always worn the gray habit of a mission sister. She had not always knelt in morning prayers, or swept the chapel floors until her knees bled through worn fabric. Once she had been Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in the language her mother had whispered to her in the dark hours before dawn. Once she had run barefoot through desert canyons, her hair flowing black and free, her voice lifting in songs that called rain from empty skies and coaxed healing from bitter herbs. That was before the soldiers came. Before the long march to the reservation. Before her mother had made the terrible choice that would save her daughter's life and damn her soul to this halfway existence between two worlds. Take her, her mother had whispered to the mission priest, pressing 8-year-old Ayana's small hand into his pale, soft palm. Make her Christian, make her safe. The words had been spoken in broken English, each syllable a sacrifice laid on the altar of survival. She speaks the old tongue. She has the gift, but the gift will kill her if she stays. 18 years had passed since that morning. 18 years of English lessons and Bible verses, of learning to walk with small steps and speak with a careful tongue, of trading her name for Catherine and her songs for hymns. But the gift had never left her. It lived in her throat like a caged bird, singing out at moments when her heart forgot the rules and remembered only love. The mission had tried to kill it with discipline. Father McKinnon, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from the same unyielding stone as the desert mountains, had made it his personal crusade to drive the heathen corruption from her soul. The leather strap was his favorite tool, but there were others. Hours of silent prayer in the hot chapel, days without food, nights spent kneeling on the stone floor until her knees swelled and bled. Your voice belongs to Christ now, he would tell her after each punishment, not to the demons of your ancestors. Christ and the civilized tongue he has given to his chosen people, but the gift would not die. It lived in the careful way she touched the sick children who came to the mission school. It lived in the herbs she gathered in secret, the ones that grew wild in the hidden places where the desert remembered what it had been before churches and bell towers, and the long shadows of crosses fell across the land. It lived in the way she sometimes caught herself humming the old songs while she worked, melodies that seemed to make the bread rise higher and the vegetables grow greener in the mission garden. The other sisters knew, but they said nothing. Sister Esperanza, who had come from the Navajo lands to the north, would sometimes meet Catherine's eyes across the chapel during morning prayers, and in those glances lived a whole conversation about the weight of carrying two worlds in one heart. Sister Rosa, whose Pueblo blood ran thick despite her Spanish surname, would leave certain herbs on Catherine's windowsill, never directly, never with words, but always with the quiet understanding of one who knew what it meant to heal in secret. They were survivors, all of them. Women who had learned to wear their faith like armor and their silence like shields. Women who knelt each morning before a pale Christ and whispered prayers in languages he had never heard, hoping that somewhere in the vast mystery of heaven, there was room for more than one way to speak to the divine. But Catherine's gift was stronger than most, and Father McKinnon's hatred ran deeper. He had been at Sand Creek, though he never spoke of it directly. She had learned this from whispered conversations between the older sisters, fragments of truth passed like contraband. In the dark hours before dawn, he had been there when the soldiers came down on Black Kettle's peaceful camp, when the morning had turned red with the blood of women and children who had thought they were safe. Something had broken in him that day, or maybe something had been born. A conviction that the only way to save the Indian was to kill everything Indian inside them. The languages, the ceremonies, the connection to the land that ran deeper than blood, all of it had to die so that something new and Christian and civilized could take its place. Catherine was his greatest challenge and his deepest failure. For 18 years he had tried to break her, and for 18 years she had bent but never snapped. Each punishment only seemed to drive the gift deeper, not destroy it. Each attempt to silence her voice only made it more necessary when it finally emerged. The scars on her back told the story of their war. Thin white lines that crisscrossed her shoulders like a map of every time she had forgotten to be smaller, quieter, more dead inside. The scar on her throat told a different story, the morning when she had been caught singing the old songs while grinding corn, and Father McKinnon had pressed a hot iron to her neck to burn out the demon's voice. It had not worked. The voice remained hoarser now, but no less powerful. If anything, the scar seemed to concentrate her gift, to focus it like sunlight through glass. When she spoke the healing words now, they carried weight that made the very air shimmer with possibility, but speaking them came with a cost that grew higher each time. Yesterday's whipping had been the worst yet. 10 lashes for saving Maria's life, delivered in front of the entire mission community as a lesson to anyone who might be tempted to remember too much of what they had been before. Catherine touched the fresh wounds through her habit, feeling the tender places where the leather had split skin and drawn blood. In a few days they would heal into new scars to join the old ones. She would carry Father McKinnon's rage on her body like a second skin, permanent and painful and impossible to forget. But Maria was alive. The little girl who had fallen from the ladder was running through the courtyard this morning, her laughter bright as water in the desert. That was worth any price Catherine might pay. The sound of hoofbeats on the desert road broke through her thoughts. She pressed closer to the wall, peering through a crack in the adobe to see who approached the mission in the heat of midday, when sensible travelers sought shade and water rather than the punishment of the open sun. A single rider emerged from the shimmer of heat waves, his horse moving with the steady gait of an animal accustomed to long distances and hard ground. Even from a distance, Catherine could see that this was not a typical visitor to San Miguel Mission. His clothes were dark leather and worn denim, practical rather than pious. Gun belts slung low on his hips, rifle secured to his saddle with the easy confidence of a man who had learned to trust in lead and powder rather than prayer and providence. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. Tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low over his face to shield his eyes from the brutal desert sun. His horse was a paint mar, brown and white patches that spoke of Indian breeding, rather than the solid colors preferred by white ranchers and cavalry officers. But it was his face, when he finally lifted his head to study the mission buildings, that made Catherine's breath catch in her throat. Even across the courtyard, even through the wavering heat, she could see the sharp angles that spoke of mixed blood. Apache cheekbones beneath a white man's hat. Dark skin that had seen too much sun and carried too many hard miles. Eyes that seemed to take in everything and reveal nothing. He was what the polite world called a half-breed, what the Apache called walks between worlds, what most people simply called trouble. The kind of man who belonged fully to neither the white settlements nor the Indian territories, who made his way through life with a gun in his hand and a price on his head more often than not. The mission bell tolled again, calling the sisters to afternoon prayers. Catherine should have been moving toward the chapel, joining the procession of gray habits and bowed heads. Instead, she remained pressed against the wall, watching as the stranger dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post outside Father McKinnon's office. There was something in the way he moved that spoke to the buried part of her, the part that remembered what it felt like to walk with pride instead of shame, to carry power instead of hiding it. His steps were sure, unhurried, the walk of a man who had never learned to make himself smaller for anyone's comfort. Father McKinnon emerged from his office before the stranger could knock, his black robes billowing around him like the wings of some enormous crow. Even from across the courtyard, Catherine could see the tension in the priest's shoulders, the way his hand instinctively moved toward the heavy wooden cross that hung at his belt, not in prayer, but as if it were a weapon he might need to draw. Two men faced each other in the blazing sun, one tall and dark and dangerous, the other pale and rigid and burning with righteous fury. She could not hear their words, but she could read the story in their postures. The stranger was asking for something. Father McKinnon was refusing to give it. Then, cutting through the desert silence like a blade, came a sound that made Catherine's scarred throat tighten with recognition and terror. A woman's voice, speaking in fluent Apache, the words clear and unashamed and beautiful as water in a drought. But the voice was not hers. The voice belonged to the stranger. And he was not speaking to Father McKinnon. He was speaking to her, preparing. And narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Apache words hung in the desert air like smoke from a sacred fire, each syllable carrying weight that made the mission walls seem suddenly fragile. Catherine's hands pressed flat against the adobe, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to process what she had just heard. The stranger's voice had wrapped around the ancient language like it belonged there, like he had been born speaking words that most white men couldn't even pronounce. Shiji Yatsi, your tears water ground that remembers. Little sister, your tears water the ground that remembers. The words were not random. They were not the clumsy attempts of a white man who had learned a few phrases for trading or threats. These were the words of ceremony, of comfort, of someone who understood that language was more than sound. It was the bridge between the world of flesh and the world of spirit. Father Mitkin's face had gone the color of old bone. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice, and when he spoke, it cracked like breaking glass. You will not speak that devil's tongue on consecrated ground, he hissed, his pale eyes blazing with the kind of fury that had once turned peaceful camps into killing fields. This is a house of God, not a den of savages. The stranger tilted his head slightly, and Catherine caught a glimpse of his profile. Strong jaw, hawk nose, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile but still remembered how to speak. Truth. When he turned back to Father McKinnon, His voice carried the lazy drawl of a man who had faced down angry priests before and found them less frightening than rattlesnakes. "Name's Jacob Thorne," he said, switching back to English with fluid ease. "I'm looking for someone. Heard she might be here. We harbor no one who would interest a man of your profession." McKinnon's voice dripped with disdain as his eyes took in the gun belt, the weathered leather, the horse that bore Apache markings. "This is a place of redemption, not a refuge for killers and half-breed drifters. Jacob Thorne." Catherine rolled the name around in her mind like a prayer bead. She had heard whispers of him in the fragments of conversation that drifted through the mission when traders came through. A gunslinger who rode the borderlands between Mexico and the territories, taking jobs that other men wouldn't touch. Some said he was a killer for hire. Others claimed he was a man who protected travelers from Apache raids. Still others whispered that he was something else entirely, a bridge between worlds, a man who could speak to both sides of the endless war that raged across the desert. "The woman I'm looking for," Thorne continued, his voice steady as stone. "She'd be about 26 now. Apache mother, Spanish father. Got a gift for healing that some folks might call witchcraft. Others might call it the touch of the divine." Catherine's breath stopped in her throat. There was no way he could be talking about her. No one outside the mission knew about her gift except the people who had needed it. The travelers who had passed through over the years. The ones she had helped in secret when they came to the mission sick or wounded. Word traveled. Strange paths in the desert, carried by wind and whispered around campfires under star-scattered skies. Father McKinnon's hand tightened on his wooden cross until his knuckles went white. "We have no such woman here. Only Christian sisters who have renounced the dark practices of their heathen past." "That so?" Thorne's voice carried just the hint of amusement, like a man who had been lied to by experts and learned to find it entertaining rather than insulting. "Because I heard tell of a little girl who fell from a bell tower yesterday, cracked her skull open like an egg. Should have died, but she didn't. Someone spoke the old words over her, called her spirit back from the edge. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife." Catherine pressed herself harder against the wall, trying to become part of the adobe itself. How could he know? Who could have told him? "Miracles happen every day in the house of the Lord," McKinnon said. Finally, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "We need no heathen explanations for God's mercy. God's mercy." Thorne repeated the words like he was tasting something bitter. "Funny thing about God's mercy, Padre. In my experience, it usually comes with a human voice attached. And sometimes that voice speaks languages that were old when your Jesus was still learning to walk." McKinnon's face flushed red above his collar. "You blaspheme on holy ground, half-breed. I'll not warn you again, and I'll not ask again." The lazy amusement vanished from Thorne's voice, replaced by something harder than the desert stone beneath their feet. "The woman I'm looking for, she's got family, Apache family. They sent me to find her." Catherine's heart stopped, then started again with a painful lurch. Family, Apache family. The words hit her like physical blows, opening old wounds she had thought were safely healed over with scar tissue in time. She had been 8 years old when her mother pressed her into the priest's hands. 8 years old and already marked by the gift that made her dangerous to keep, but too precious to kill. Her father had been a Spanish trader who had loved her mother for exactly 1 season before moving on to the next settlement, the next woman, the next temporary arrangement that required no promises and left no lasting ties, but her mother's people. They had been real. They had been family in the way that mattered, bound not by blood alone but by shared songs and common struggles, and the knowledge that they were all part of something larger than themselves. She had aunts and uncles and cousins scattered across the desert, following the old paths, living the old ways, carrying the old words in their hearts like embers that could kindle into flame when the time was right, That had they really sent this man to find her? After 18 years of silence, 18 years of believing she was lost to them forever, had they finally come looking? "I don't know what lies you've been told," McKinnon was saying, his voice rising toward the shrill pitch it reached when he was about to reach for the leather strap. "But there are no Apache here. Only Christian women who have been saved from the darkness of their former lives. Saved." Thorne spoke the word like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "That what you call it when you beat a woman for speaking her grandmother's language? When you scar her throat for singing the songs that were sung over her cradle?" Catherine's hand flew to her throat, fingers tracing the raised line of scar tissue that marked where the iron had burned away her voice and nearly burned away her life. How could he know about that? The scarring had happened in the early years, when she was still young enough to believe that resistance might be possible, still foolish enough to think that the old ways could survive in this place of gray habits and silent prayers. McKinnon took a step backward, his face going pale again. What do you know of such things?" "I know that a man who preaches salvation while wielding a branding iron is a man who's forgotten what salvation means." Thorne's hand dropped to rest casually on the grip of his pistol, not threatening. "Exactly, but making a point that didn't need words. I know that the woman I'm looking for bears your handiwork on her body like the stations of the cross. And I know that her people want her to come home." Home. The word hit Catherine like a physical blow, doubling her over with the force of longing she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Home was a concept she had trained herself to forget, a dream too dangerous to dream. Home was the sound of her mother's voice singing the dawn songs, the smell of sage burning in the ceremonial fires, the feeling of belonging to something larger and older, and more permanent than the adobe walls that had become her prison. But home was also the place where her gift had first manifested, where she had called rain from clear skies and healed a dying horse with nothing but touch and ancient words. Home was the place where her power had marked her as different, dangerous, valuable enough to trade away for the promise of safety. Would her people really want her back? After 18 years of mission life, of Christian prayers and English words, and the slow erosion of everything that had once made her who she was. She barely remembered how to braid her hair in the old style, barely remembered the names of the plants that held healing power, barely remembered the melodies that could call spirits from the other world. What if she had become too much of what the mission had tried to make her? What if there was nothing left of Ayanna, eternal blossom, and only Catherine remained scarred, broken, more ghost than woman? "There is no one here for you to take," McKinnon said, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. He sounded tired now, worn down by years of fighting battles he couldn't quite win. "These women have chosen their path. They serve God now. Chosen." Thorne's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "Funny word to use about women who were children when you got your hands on them. Children who had no choice but to bend or break under your particular brand of Christian charity." He stepped closer to McKinnon, and Catherine could see the way. The priest flinched despite himself. There was something in Thorne's presence that spoke of violence held barely in check, of a man who had seen too much death and dispensed too much justice to be impressed by religious authority. "Here's what's going to happen, Padre. You're going to tell me where she is, and then you're going to let me talk to her. And if she wants to leave with me, you're going to let her go without any fuss or bother or threats about eternal damnation. And if I refuse," Thorne's smile was sharp as a knife blade, "then I start asking questions around the territory about the kind of salvation you practice here, about the scars on women's backs and the silence that hangs over this place like smoke from a funeral pyre. Folks might be interested to know how you've been shepherding your flock all these years." McKinnon's face cycled through several shades of red and white. Catherine could see the war playing out in his expression, the desire to maintain his authority warring with the practical understanding that this was not a fight he could win. Men like Jacob Thorne didn't make idle threats. They made promises, and they kept them with bullets if necessary. Finally, the priest straightened his shoulders and tried to recover some semblance of dignity. Very well. But you will find that the women here are content with their lot. They have found peace in service to the Almighty. We'll see about that. Thorn tipped his hat back slightly, and for the first time Catherine could see his eyes clearly. They were dark as winter nights, but there was something in them that reminded her of the desert after rain, hard and unforgiving on the surface, but holding the promise of life beneath. As the two men turned toward the chapel where the sisters would be finishing their afternoon prayers, Catherine made a decision that surprised her with its suddenness. Instead of fleeing deeper into the shadows, instead of hiding until the dangerous stranger rode away and left her to the familiar misery of her captivity, she stepped away from the wall. Her bare feet made no sound on the packed earth of the courtyard. As she moved toward the two men, the afternoon sun blazed down on her gray habit, turning the coarse cloth into an oven that trapped heat against her scarred back. But she walked steadily, her chin raised, her hands steady at her sides. It was time to see if 18 years of mission life had killed everything that mattered about who she had once been. It was time to find out if Ayanna still lived somewhere beneath the careful construction of Sister Catherine. It was time to discover whether home was a place she could still recognize, or just another word for a dream she had been forbidden to dream. The desert heat shimmered between Catherine and the two men like a living thing, distorting their shapes until they seemed to dance in the wavering air. Her bare feet found their rhythm on the hard-packed earth, each step carrying her further from the safety of shadows and closer to a moment that would change everything. The gray habit clung to her body, heavy with heat and the weight of 18 years' worth of carefully constructed obedience. But something had shifted inside her chest, something that felt like a door opening after being locked for so long that she had forgotten what lay behind it. The Apache words Jacob Thorne had spoken Siji Yatsi still echoed in her ears, calling to parts of herself she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself they were dead. Father McKinnon noticed her first. His pale eyes widened as he saw her approaching, and she watched him calculate distances, probabilities, the chances that he could send her away before the stranger saw her. His mouth opened to speak, probably to order her back to the chapel, back to prayers, back to the safe silence that had protected them both from this moment for so many years. But Jacob Thorne turned before McKinnon could form the words. The gunslinger's dark eyes met hers across 20 feet of blazing courtyard, and Catherine felt something electric pass between them. Recognition maybe, though they had never met. Or perhaps it was something deeper, the recognition of shared blood, shared wounds, shared understanding of what it meant to walk between worlds that wanted to tear you in half. He was taller than she had realized from her hiding place against the wall, taller and broader, with the kind of presence that seemed to take up more space than his physical form should have occupied. His face was a map of hard miles and difficult choices, carved by desert wind and marked by violence. But his eyes held something that made her think of her grandfather's eyes in the moments before he began the old stories, wisdom, pain, and underneath it all, a kind of gentleness that had survived everything life had thrown at it. Sister Catherine, McKinnon's voice cracked like a whip, sharp with warning and barely controlled panic. Return to the chapel immediately. Afternoon prayers are not yet finished. Catherine stopped walking but didn't turn away. For the first time in 18 years, she looked directly at Father McKinnon without lowering her eyes, without making herself smaller, without swallowing the words that wanted to come. The prayers can wait, she said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, stronger than she remembered. Clearer, despite the scar that roughened her throat. McKinnon's face went through several rapid changes of color. You will obey, no. The word fell into the desert silence like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the careful order of the mission world. I will not. Jacob Thorne smiled, and it transformed his entire face. The hard lines softened, the winter night eyes warmed, and for a moment Catherine could see the boy he might have been before the world taught him that gentleness was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. "Aho, Shichiyatsi," he said softly. "I was beginning to think they had buried you so deep you couldn't find your way back to the surface. Double quotes, yes, little sister." The words wrapped around her like her mother's arms, like the blankets that had covered her as a child when the desert nights grew cold and the stars seemed close enough to touch. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not yet. There would be time for tears later, when she knew whether this moment was the beginning of salvation or just another kind of ending. "Who are you?" she asked, though she already knew his name. What she really meant was, "Who are you to my people? Who are you to speak the old words with such authority? Who are you to come here and crack open the careful shell I've built around my heart?" "Jacob Thorne," he said, and then switching to Apache. "Te Jacob Thorne Yinishai. Tadake Ni Nishwi. I am called Jacob Thorne. I am born for the Bitter Water people." The clan name hit her like a physical blow. Togaki Si, Ni, her mother's clan. Her clan, though she had not spoken the name aloud in 18 years, had barely whispered it even in her prayers. The Bitter Water people, who had taught her that some things were worth the pain they cost, that some gifts came wrapped in suffering, that the most sacred water was often the hardest to swallow. "Tabaha Nishwi," she replied, the words coming from some deep place that had never learned English, never learned shame. "I am born for the water's edge people." Her father's clan, claimed through blood that was half Spanish but had never been counted against her by the Apache way of reckoning kinship. In the old world, the world before missions and forced marchers in the long war between red and white, she would have been his clan daughter. He would have been responsible for her welfare, her protection, her education in the ways that mattered. McKinnon stepped between them, his black robes billowing like the wings of some enormous carrion bird. "Enough of this heathen babbling. Sister Catherine, you will return to your duties immediately, or I will be forced to..." "To what?" Jacob's voice cut through McKinnon's threats like a blade through silk. "Beat her again? Brand her throat with hot iron? Lock her in the root cellar for speaking the language her grandmother sang to her in the cradle?" The priest's face went white, then red, then white again. "How dare you? Those are lies." "Are they?" Jacob stepped closer, and McKinnon involuntarily took a step back. "Because I see the scars on her throat. I see the way she moves like someone who's learned to expect pain from the people who claim to love her. I see 18 years of your particular brand of salvation written on her body like scripture." Catherine's hand rose to touch her throat, fingers tracing the raised line of scar tissue. She had learned to hide it beneath high collars and careful positioning, but Jacob's eyes missed nothing. He saw her exactly as she was marked, scarred, but unbroken. "My grandmother," she said, and her voice carried clearly across the courtyard, "used to say that the most sacred voices were often the ones that had been tested by fire. Your grandmother was a wise woman." Jacob's eyes never left her face. "She also said that a voice silenced by fear is a voice that has forgotten its purpose. But a voice that chooses silence to survive, that voice is gathering strength for the moment when it will be needed most." Catherine stared at him. Those were her grandmother's exact words, spoken in the ceremony lodge during the last winter, before the soldiers came. Words she had never repeated to anyone, words she had barely allowed herself to remember. How could he know them? "She sent me to find you," Jacob said, answering her unspoken question. "Your grandmother, she's old now, but she still dreams true. She saw you in the place of gray stones and iron bells. She saw your voice trapped like a bird in a cage made of other people's fear. My grandmother is dead." The words came out harder than Catherine intended. "She died in the march to the reservation." I watched her fall and never get up again. Jacob shook his head slowly. Your grandmother lives. She lives with the band that never went to the reservation, the ones who took to the deep desert and learned to be ghosts when the soldiers came hunting. She lives and she dreams of you every night. She sent me to tell you that the cage door was never locked. You've been free to fly away any time you chose. The world tilted sideways. Catherine felt her knees buckle, and only pride kept her upright. Her grandmother alive? After all these years of mourning, all these nights of whispering prayers for the dead, the old woman lived? Lies! McMinn's voice cracked with desperation. All lies meant to tempt you from the path of righteousness. This man is a killer, a half-breed devil sent to lead you back into darkness. Maybe, Jacob said calmly. But if I'm a devil, what does that make you? A man who preaches love while wielding a whip? A shepherd who leaves scars on his sheep? He turned back to Catherine, and his voice gentled. Your grandmother told me to tell you something else. She said to remind you of the morning when you called the lightning down to save the horses from the grass fire. She said you were 7 years old, and you stood in the rain you had summoned, laughing like the thunder spirits themselves. Catherine's breath caught. That memory was so old, so buried beneath years of careful forgetting, that she had almost convinced herself it was a dream. But she could suddenly smell the ozone in the air, feel the electricity raising the hair on her arms, hear her own wild laughter mixing with the thunder as the rain fell in sheets and saved the horses from the flames. She said to tell you, Jacob continued, that power like yours doesn't diminish with disuse, it only grows stronger. Like a river that's been dammed, when the barrier finally breaks, the flood is more powerful than the stream ever was. Stop, the word came out as barely more than a whisper. Catherine pressed her hands to her temples, trying to hold back the rush of memories, the flood of everything she had forced herself to forget. Please, I can't, this isn't, she also said. Jacob's voice was soft as a prayer now, that when you were ready to remember who you really are, I should call you by your true name, the name she whispered over your cradle, the name that lives in the place where fear can't reach. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that she could smell the desert sage that clung to his clothes, close enough that when he spoke, the words seemed to come from inside her own heart. Ayana, eternal blossom, voice of the sacred fire, your people are calling you home. The name hit her like lightning hitting dry wood, igniting everything she had tried so hard to keep buried. Ayana, not Catherine, not sister, not the careful construction of compliance and fear that she had worn like armor for 18 years. Ayana, daughter of the bitter water people, granddaughter of the woman who dreamed true, keeper of the voice that could call rain and heal wounds, and speak to the spirits that lived in the space. Between breath and silence, she felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been locked so tight she had forgotten it was there. Power rushed through her like water through a broken dam, and for a moment the air around her shimmered with possibility. The mission bell chose that moment to toll, its bronze voice calling the sisters to evening prayers. But for the first time in 18 years, Catherine didn't hear it as a summons. She heard it as a farewell. Ahihi Shiche, she whispered, the Apache words for thank you. My grandfather, falling from her lips like stones dropped into a sacred pool. Then, louder, in English, I remember now. I remember who I was before they taught me to be afraid of my own voice. Father McKinnon made a sound like a wounded animal. You cannot leave. This is your home, your family, your salvation. Catherine turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time in years. She saw a man eaten hollow by his own fear, a man who had convinced himself that breaking others was the same as saving them, a man who had confused silence with peace, compliance, with contentment. No, she said, and her voice carried the authority of thunder. the certainty of rain in the desert. This was never my home. This was the place where I learned to survive. But survival isn't the same as living. She looked back at Jacob, this man who had traveled across the desert to speak her grandmother's words, to remind her that cages were only prisons if you forgot you had wings. "How far is it?" she asked. "To the people who remember my real name?" "3 days hard riding," he said. "Less if we push the horses. And my grandmother? She's really alive? Alive and waiting. She's been waiting for 18 years. Catherine closed her eyes and felt the power move through her like a current. Like the memory of lightning, like the voice of the sacred fire that had lived in her throat since birth. When she opened them again, she was no longer Sister Catherine of the San Miguel Mission. She was Ayanna, eternal blossom, and she was finally ready to bloom. The transformation that had begun in Catherine's heart now spread outward like ripples. In still water, touching everything around her with the force of a long-suppressed truth finally given voice. The air itself seemed different, charged with the electricity that comes before storms, before revelation, before the moment when the world splits open to reveal what has always been hidden beneath its surface. Jacob watched her face change. Watched. 18 years of careful submission fall away like a snake shedding skin. The woman who stood before him now carried herself differently, spine straight, not from discipline, but from pride. Chin raised not in defiance, but in certainty, eyes bright with the fire that had never truly been extinguished, only banked like coals, waiting for the right wind to fan them back to flame. "Aho Shiji," he said softly. "Welcome back to the world of the living." But Father McKinnon was not ready to surrender his prize so easily. 18 years of shaping this woman into his vision of proper Christian womanhood would not be undone by a few heathen words and the smooth lies of a half-breed gunslinger. He stepped forward, his black robes rustling like raven wings, his pale eyes burning with the kind of righteous fury that had once justified massacres in the name of salvation. "You are deceived, Catherine," he said, his voice taking on the resonant tones he used for sermons, for confessions, for the moments when he needed to remind his flock who held the keys to their eternal souls. "This man fills your head with fantasies, with the false promise of a world that no longer exists. Your people, your real people, are dead, scattered, confined to reservations where they slowly starve on government promises and rot-gut whiskey. Ayanna she would think of herself by that name now. No matter what came next, felt the familiar weight of his words, the way they pressed down on her spirit like stones placed carefully on a grave. For 18 years, those words had been her reality. The outside world was dangerous, hostile, a place where people like her were hunted, killed, or worse. Safety lay in submission, in accepting the narrow confines of mission life, in being grateful for the gray walls that protected her from the chaos beyond. But now she could see the chains that had always been there, invisible links forged from fear and wrapped so carefully around her heart that she had mistaken them for protection. McKinnon had never needed locks on her door, because he had put the locks inside her mind, inside her soul, inside the very way she understood her place in the world. "Tell me something, Father," she said, and her voice carried a new note, something that made the priest's eyes narrow with suspicion. "In all your sermons about the love of Christ, about forgiveness and redemption, when have you ever spoken of my people with anything but hatred? When have you ever suggested that the Apache way might contain even a fragment of divine truth?" McKinnon's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. "The ways of the heathens are the ways of darkness, are they?" Ayanna turned to gesture toward the mission garden, where her careful tending had coaxed life from desert soil that should have been too poor to support anything but scrub brush and stones. "The knowledge I used to make your vegetables grow, where did that come from? The herbs I gathered to heal Sister Rose's lung fever last winter. Who taught me which plants held medicine and which held poison? She could see understanding dawning in Jacob's eyes, a slow smile spreading across his weathered features as he watched her dismantle 18 years of careful conditioning with the precision of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. The words, "I," spoke over little Maria when she fell, the words that brought her back from the edge of death. Those weren't Christian words, were they, Father? They were Apache words. The same devil's tongue you've spent 18 years trying to beat out of me, and yet they worked. They saved a child's life when your prayers failed. McKinnon's face had gone the color of old parchment. You admit to practicing witchcraft, to calling on demons? I admit to using the gifts the Creator gave me. Ayana's voice grew stronger with each word, fed by a certainty that had been building like pressure behind a dam for nearly 2 decades. Gifts that flow from the same source as every miracle in your precious Bible. Do you think Moses used Latin when he called water from the rock? Do you think Jesus spoke English when he raised Lazarus from the dead? The priest's hand moved instinctively toward the wooden cross at his belt, not in prayer, but as if it were a weapon he might draw. Blasphemy! You compare your heathen sorcery to the miracles of the Almighty? I compare power to power, Ayana replied calmly, and truth to truth. And I ask you this, if my people's ways are so evil, why do they heal instead of harm? If their words are the devil's tongue, why do they bring life instead of death? Jacob had been silent through this exchange, watching with the stillness of a hunter who knows that the wrong word at the wrong moment can scatter the prey. But now he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of years spent moving between worlds, of understanding truths that existed in the spaces between black and white thinking. Father, he said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he addressed the priest, as if he recognized a fellow wounded soul. I've ridden with cavalry units that prayed to your Jesus before they rode down on sleeping camps full of women and children. I've seen men wearing crosses burn lodges with families still inside them. I've watched soldiers who never missed Sunday service cut down unarmed Apache trying to surrender under flags of truce. McKinnon's face twisted with something that might have been pain or might have been rage. The sins of men do not invalidate the truth of Christ. No, they don't, Jacob agreed. Just like the sins of some Apache don't invalidate the truths they carry. But here's what I've learned in my years on the frontier, Padre. The devil doesn't care what language you use to call him, and neither does God. He stepped closer to Ayana, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, solid and real and utterly without the spiritual chill that always seemed to emanate from McKinnon's presence. Your grandmother told me something else, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more force than McKinnon's loudest sermon. She said that when the white soldiers came to destroy the people, they didn't just bring guns and disease. They brought a different kind of weapon, the weapon of making us believe that everything about ourselves was wrong, evil, something to be ashamed of. Ayana felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of recognition, of finally seeing clearly something that had been hidden in plain sight for most of her life. She said, Jacob continued, that the most powerful medicine they used against us wasn't bullets or smallpox blankets. It was convincing us to hate our own voices, to fear our own power, to see ourselves through their eyes instead of through the eyes of the Creator who made us exactly as we are. Lies, McKinnon hissed, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. Seductive lies meant to lead the faithful astray. Then let me ask you something, Father, Ayana said, turning to face him fully. If my people's ways are so evil, why have you worked so hard to make me forget them? If they hold no power, why does it matter whether I speak Apache or English? Why does it matter whether I call the Creator by the name my grandmother taught? Me or the name you prefer? The priest's mouth worked soundlessly for a long moment. When he finally found his voice, it came out thin and strained, like wires stretched to the breaking point. Because there is only one path to salvation, one way to approach the throne of the Almighty. To suggest otherwise is to invite chaos, to open the door to every heresy and delusion that has ever plagued mankind. Or, Jacob said quietly, it's to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the Creator is big enough to hear prayers in every language ever spoken. Smart enough to recognize sincere hearts no matter what cultural clothing they wear. Loving enough to work through Apache medicine women just as surely as through Christian priests. Ayanna felt something shift inside her chest, something that felt like a great weight finally being lifted. For 18 years, she had carried the burden of believing that she was fundamentally flawed, that the very core of her being was an offense against the divine order. She had accepted that her gifts were curses, that her heritage was shame, that her voice was a problem to be solved rather than a treasure to be celebrated. But now, standing in the blazing desert sun with this man who spoke her language and honored her grandmother's wisdom, she could feel the truth settling into her bones like water soaking into parched earth. She was not broken. She had never been broken. She had been bent, constrained, forced into shapes that were never meant to contain her, but the essential spark of who she was had never been extinguished. "There's something else your grandmother wanted me to tell you," Jacob said, and his voice took on the cadence of ceremony, of words that carried weight beyond their simple meaning. She said that the old prophecies speak of a time when the people would be scattered like seeds on the wind. But seeds scattered by the wind don't die. They take root in new ground. They grow into something stronger than what came before. He reached into his coat and withdrew something wrapped in soft deerskin. When he unfolded the leather, Ayanna gasped. Nestled inside was a necklace of silver and turquoise, worked in the traditional Apache style, but with modifications she had never seen before. Christian crosses were interwoven with traditional symbols, Spanish words in elegant script wound around Apache pictographs, creating something entirely new and entirely beautiful. "She made this for you," Jacob said, holding the necklace up so that it caught the desert light and threw it back in brilliant flashes of blue and silver. "She said to tell you that this is what you are, not Apache or Spanish or Christian, but all of them woven together into something the world has never seen before, something beautiful, something sacred." Ayanna reached out with trembling fingers to touch the necklace. The silver was warm from Jacob's body heat, the turquoise smooth as river stones. She could feel power humming in the metalwork, not the dark sorcery that McKinnon feared, but something clean and bright and full of love. "She calls it the new medicine," Jacob said softly. "The healing that comes not from rejecting parts of yourself, but from learning to weave them all together into something stronger than any of them could be alone." McKinnon made a sound like a dying animal. "You cannot mean to leave. Not now, not after everything." His voice broke, and for a moment the mask of righteous authority slipped enough to reveal the desperate man beneath. "I saved you, Catherine. I gave you sanctuary when the world wanted you dead. I fed you, clothed you, taught you to read and write. You saved my body," Ayanna replied, and there was no anger in her voice, only a kind of profound sadness. "But you tried to kill my soul. You gave me sanctuary from the world's hatred by teaching me to hate myself. You fed my body while starving my spirit." She turned back to Jacob, and when she spoke, her voice rang with the authority of someone who had finally found her way home to herself. "When do we leave?" The word "leave" hung in the desert air like the echo of a gunshot, reverberating off the mission walls and seeming to shake the very foundations of the world Father McKinnon had spent 18 years building. Ayanna watched his face cycle through disbelief, rage, and something that looked almost like grief as the reality of her decision settled into his bones. "You have until sunset," Jacob said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had learned that the most dangerous threats were often spoken in whispers. "Gather what you need. What you can carry, We ride at first dark. McKinnon found his voice, though it came out cracked and desperate. You cannot simply take her. She is under the protection of the church, a ward of this mission. There are laws. Laws? Jacob's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. You want to talk about laws, Padre? Let's talk about the law that says you can't hold a grown woman against her will. Let's talk about the law that says beating someone for speaking their native language is assault. Let's talk about the law that says burning a woman's throat with a hot iron is torture, no matter what holy book you wave while you do it. The priest's face went white, then red, then white again. Those were acts of discipline, of spiritual correction. Those were crimes, Jacob said flatly. And if you want to involve the territorial authorities, I'm sure they'd be very interested to hear about your methods of spiritual correction, especially since I can produce witnesses. For the first time since Jacob had arrived, Ayanna saw real fear in McKinnon's eyes. Not the righteous concern of a shepherd for his flock, but the naked terror of a man who suddenly realized that his authority had never been as absolute as he believed. What witnesses? McKinnon demanded, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. Jacob smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. You think you're the only one who's ever ridden away from this place, Padre? You think none of your former sisters ever talked about what really goes on behind these walls? I've spent the last month tracking down women who used to call San Miguel home. Interesting conversations, very detailed memories. Ayanna felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had always assumed she was alone in her suffering, that the other sisters who had disappeared over the years had simply been transferred to other missions, other duties. The thought that some of them might have escaped, might have found voices to speak the truth she had kept locked inside her heart, was both thrilling and terrifying. Sister Hesperanza, she said quietly, remembering the Navajo woman who had vanished 3 years ago after being caught teaching children traditional songs. And Sister Rosa, Sister Magdalena who spoke Pueblo. Among others, Jacob nodded. Turns out there's a whole network of women who've walked away from places like this. They look out for each other now, help each other heal from what was done to them in the name of salvation. McKinnon's hand moved to his cross again, clutching it like a drowning man grasping for driftwood. They were corrupted, turned away from the path of righteousness by the same demons that now corrupt you. Or maybe, Ayanna interrupted, her voice steady as stone, they remembered that they were human beings with the right to choose their own path to the divine. Maybe they remembered that God doesn't require you to hate yourself in order to love Him. The priest turned toward her with something like panic in his eyes. Catherine, please, think of what you're doing. Think of what you're throwing away. You have a place here, a purpose, a calling. I have a cage, she replied. A comfortable cage, well appointed and filled with the finest intentions, but still a cage. And I finally remembered that I have wings. She turned away from him then, walking toward the small dormitory room that had been her world for 18 years. Behind her, she could hear McKinnon's voice rising to near hysteria. You'll die out there. The desert will kill you, or the soldiers will, or your own people who won't recognize what you've become. You think that half-breed gunslinger cares about your soul? He's using you, filling your head with lies to serve his own purposes. Ayanna didn't turn around. She had heard enough of his words, absorbed enough of his poison. It was time to start emptying her system of the fear he had poured into her drop by drop over the course of nearly 2 decades. Her room was small, sparse, containing little more than a narrow cot, a wooden chest for her few possessions, and a crucifix on the wall that had watched over her sleep with cold ceramic eyes. She had looked at that crucifix every night for 18 years, had whispered prayers to it in moments of desperation and despair. But she had never felt anything looking back at her. Now she understood why. The Christ she had been taught to worship was a diminished thing, a god who demanded the death of everything beautiful and wild and natural in his followers. That was not the creator her grandmother had told her about, the one who made the desert flowers bloom and taught the wind to sing. She opened the wooden chest and began to sort through her possessions. Most of them were things the mission had. Given her rough gray dresses, heavy shoes, a rosary made of carved wood. But at the bottom, wrapped in layers of cloth and hidden beneath everything else, were the things she had smuggled from her old life. A piece of turquoise her mother had pressed into her palm the morning she was given to the mission, a small pouch of cornmeal blessed by her grandmother before the soldiers came, a eagle feather that had fallen at her feet during the last ceremony she had ever attended as a free child. She had kept these things in secret for 18 years, never daring to touch them except in the darkest hours of the night, when the weight of her captivity threatened to crush her entirely. Now she brought them into the light, holding each one like a talisman against the years of forgetting. The turquoise was still blue as summer sky. The cornmeal still carried the faint scent of sacred smoke. The eagle feather still held the memory of flight. Ayanna. Jacob's voice came from the doorway, soft and respectful. We need to go soon. McKinnon sent someone to town, probably to bring back help. She looked up from her packing, meeting his dark eyes across the small space. What kind of help? The kind that comes armed and asks questions later, he replied grimly. There are people in that town who've been looking for an excuse to ride out here and settle some old scores. McKinnon's just given them one. Ayanna felt her stomach clench with familiar fear, but this time the fear was different. This time it was the clean fear of immediate danger, not the soul-killing fear of slow spiritual strangulation. This time she could fight back. How long do we have? Hour, maybe less. Jacob stepped into the room, his presence somehow making this small space seem even smaller. Can you ride? She almost laughed. Father McKinnon made sure I never learned. Said it wasn't proper for a woman to sit astride a horse like a man. Of course he did. Jacob's mouth tightened into a grim line. Well, you're about to get a very quick education. Hope you're not afraid of heights. Ayanna finished stuffing her few treasures into a leather satchel that had once belonged to her mother. As she worked, she became aware of sounds drifting in from the courtyard, the rapid footsteps of the other sisters, whispered conversations that cut off abruptly when anyone approached, the nervous whinny of Jacob's horse as it sensed the tension. In the air, the others, she said suddenly. The other women here. What will happen to them when McKinnon's friends arrive looking for trouble? Jacob's expression darkened. Nothing good. Men like that don't make fine distinctions between willing participants and unwilling prisoners. To them, you're all just squaws who've been living too close to civilization for too long. The casual brutality of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had been so focused on her own liberation that she hadn't considered the price others might pay for her freedom. The other sisters had their own stories, their own reasons for seeking sanctuary within these walls, their own complicated relationships with the man who controlled their daily lives. Some, like Sister Rosa, might welcome the chance to escape. Others had been here so long that the outside world had become more terrifying than their captivity. I can't leave them, she said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew how impossible they were. I can't just walk away and let innocent women pay for my choices. You can't save them all, Ayanna. Jacob's voice was gentle but implacable. Some people have to choose salvation for themselves. You can't force it on them any more than McKinnon could force it on you. She wanted to argue, to insist that there had to be another way, but the sound of distant hoofbeats cut through her protests. Many horses riding hard, still miles away but closing fast. Time's up, Jacob said. We go now or we don't go at all. Ayanna slung the leather satchel across her shoulder and took one last look around the room that had been her world for so long. It looked smaller now, shabbier, like a costume she had finally outgrown. The crucifix on the wall stared down at her with the same cold indifference it had always shown. But now she could see it for what it was, not a symbol of divine love, but a reminder of how far some people would go to remake God in their own image. She walked out of that room and didn't look back. In the courtyard, chaos was beginning to take hold. The other sisters had emerged from the chapel, their faces pale with confusion and fear. Some clustered around Father McKinnon, who was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, his black robes billowing behind him. Others stood apart, watching. Jacob, with a mixture of curiosity and terror. Sister Rosa caught Ayana's eye across the courtyard. The older woman's face was carefully neutral, but something in her expression suggested understanding, even approval. She nodded once, barely perceptibly, and Ayana felt a surge of gratitude for that small gesture of support. Sister Catherine, one of the younger women, a Cheyenne girl named Mary who had arrived only 2 years ago, broke away from the group, around McKinnon, and ran toward her. "Is it true? Are you really leaving?" Ayana caught the girl's hands in hers, feeling how thin they were, how cold, despite the desert heat. "It's true." "Take me with you," Mary whispered, her eyes bright with desperate hope. "Please, I can't stay here anymore. I'm dying here, piece by piece, day by day." The words hit Ayana like arrows, each one finding its mark in the guilt that was already eating at her heart. But before she could respond, Jacob appeared at her elbow. "We have to go, now." The hoofbeats were closer now, close enough that they could see dust rising on the eastern horizon, close enough that they could count. The riders, at least a dozen, maybe more, coming hard and fast with the kind of purpose that ended in blood. "I'm sorry," Ayana whispered to Mary, pressing the girl's hands once more before releasing them. "I'm so sorry." She turned toward Jacob's horse, her heart breaking with every step. Behind her, she could hear Mary's quiet sobs, could feel the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes watching her choose her own freedom over their safety. Jacob helped her up onto the horse's back, settling her behind him with quick, efficient movements. The animal danced nervously beneath them, sensing the approaching danger, eager to run. "Hold on tight," Jacob said. "This is going to be rough." As they rode out of the mission gates, Ayana looked back once at the place that had been her prison and her protection for 18 years. Father McKinnon stood in the center of the courtyard, his arms raised as if in benediction or curse, his mouth moving in what might have been prayer or profanity. The other sisters watched from the shadows of the buildings, some weeping, some stone-faced, all of them trapped in a world that was about to become much more dangerous because of the choice she had made. The guilt was a physical weight in her chest, but beneath it, growing stronger with every mile they put between themselves and San Miguel, was something else. Something that felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. It felt like freedom. And despite everything, despite the cost and the pain and the uncertainty that lay ahead, Ayana found herself smiling as the desert wind whipped through her hair and carried them toward a horizon that suddenly seemed full of infinite possibility. The desert at sunset was a cathedral of fire and shadow, painted in colors that had no names in any language Ayana had ever learned. Crimson bled into gold, gold melted into purple, and purple deepened into the kind of blue that lived in the space between day and night, between the world of flesh and the world of spirit. She had seen countless sunsets from the mission walls, but always through windows, always filtered through glass and iron bars and the weight of her captivity. Now, riding behind Jacob on his paintmar, feeling the animal's powerful muscles bunch and release beneath them as they climbed the rocky trail that led away from San Miguel, she understood for the first time why her grandmother had called the desert the place where earth touches sky. Out here, beyond walls and bells and the careful order of mission life, the horizon stretched endlessly in all directions, promising nothing but demanding everything. The horse picked its way carefully up the narrow path that wound between towering red sandstone formations. Jacob guided the animal with subtle shifts of weight and pressure, his body moving in perfect harmony with the mare's gait. Behind them, the dust cloud that marked their pursuers had grown larger, closer, though the riders themselves were still hidden by the maze of canyons and mesas that made this part of the desert a natural fortress for those who knew how to use it. How much farther? Ayanna asked, having to raise her voice above the wind that whipped through the rock formations like the breath of some enormous sleeping giant. To where we're going tonight. Another hour, maybe less. Jacob's voice was steady, unworried, though she could feel the tension in his shoulders where her arms wrapped around his waist. To your grandmother's people? 2 more days if we push hard and the weather holds. Ayanna tried to imagine 2 more days of this, the constant motion, the ache in muscles she had never used, the vast emptiness of sky and stone stretching out around them like an ocean made of light and air. Part of her was terrified by the zophied immensity of it all, by the way the desert seemed to swallow human presence whole, leaving no trace that they had ever existed. But another part of her, a part that had been buried so deep she had almost forgotten it existed, recognized this place as home. Not the specific location. The terrain around San Miguel was foreign to her, hundreds of miles from the mountain valleys where she had been born, but the feeling of it. The way the wind carried messages in a dozen different scents. The way the rocks held stories in their layers of color. The way the silence was not empty, but full, pregnant with possibility. Jacob, she said, and then paused, not sure how to voice the question that had been growing in her mind since they left the mission. The things you told me about my grandmother, about the prophecies and the scattered seeds, how do I know they're true? How do I know you're not just another man trying to use me for his own purposes? She felt him tense slightly, but his voice when he answered was calm, thoughtful. You don't. You can't. That's the thing about faith, Ayanna. It's not about knowing. It's about choosing. You can choose to believe that I'm telling the truth, or you can choose to believe that I'm lying. Either way, you're making a choice about who you want to be and what kind of world you want to live in. The honesty of his answers surprised her. She had expected reassurances, protests of sincerity, perhaps even anger at having his motives questioned. Instead, he had given her something more valuable, the acknowledgement that she had the right to doubt, to question, to make her own decisions about who to trust. McKinnon never gave me choices like that, she said quietly. With him, there was only one truth, one path, one way to understand everything. Doubt was sin. Questions were rebellion. Maybe. That's because McKinnon was more afraid of your questions than you were afraid of his answers. Jacob guided the horse around a boulder that had fallen across the trail, the animal's hooves finding purchase on stone that looked smooth as glass. A man who's sure of his truth doesn't need to beat it into people. It stands on its own. They rode in silence for a while after that, the only sounds the soft clip-clop of the horse's hooves on stone, the whisper of wind through the canyons, and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. As the last light faded from the sky, Jacob turned the mare off the main trail and into a narrow cleft between 2 towering rock faces. The passage was so narrow that Ayanna could have reached out and touched both walls at the same time, and so dark that she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. But Jacob seemed to know exactly where he was going, guiding the horse through turns and passages that felt more like tunnels than trails. Finally, they emerged into a small circular canyon, hidden completely from the outside world. A thin stream trickled down one wall, feeding a pool of clear water that reflected the first stars beginning to appear overhead. Desert willows grew along the water's edge, their delicate leaves rustling in the evening breeze, and someone had built a small fire ring from carefully arranged stones. "We'll rest here tonight," Jacob said, swinging down from the saddle and then helping Ayanna dismount. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground. She had never realized how much effort it took just to stay balanced on a moving Horse. Others have used this place, she observed, looking at the fire ring, the way the grass had been worn away in spots where bedrolls had been laid out. It's a safe camp, Jacob confirmed, beginning to unsaddle the horse. Part of a network of hidden places that stretches across the desert. Some were made by Apache, some by Navajo, some by folks like us who need to move unseen. Folks like us. The phrase made something warm unfurl in Ayana's chest. For 18 years she had been us and them, us Christians and them heathens, U.S. civilized and them savage, us saved and them damned. But now she was part of a different us, one that included people who moved between worlds, who carried multiple truths, who refused to be limited by other people's definitions of what they should be. Jacob built a small fire with practiced efficiency, coaxing flame from tinder with the ease of a man who had spent more nights under stars than under roofs. As the light danced across the canyon walls, painting shifting patterns of gold and shadow, Ayana found herself studying his face more carefully than she had been able to do during their escape. He was older than she had first thought, probably closer to 40 than 30, with lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and too many hard decisions. His skin was the deep bronze of someone who lived outdoors, marked here and there with small scars that told stories she couldn't read. His hands, as they fed sticks to the fire, moved with the careful precision of a gunfighter, but also with the gentleness of someone who understood that some things were too precious to handle roughly. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. He looked up from the fire, one eyebrow raised in question. "What did you expect?" She thought about it, trying to put her vague preconceptions into words. Someone harder, I think. More like the men who came to the mission, sometimes traders and soldiers and territorial officials. Men who looked at the world like it was something to be conquered. Jacob smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. "Maybe I used to be like that. When I was younger, angrier, more sure that I knew how the world was supposed to work. But the desert has a way of teaching you humility if you live in it long enough." He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out strips of dried meat, a small bag of parched corn, and a battered tin cup. Simple trail food, but to Ayana it looked like a feast. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten anything that hadn't been blessed, sanctified, and served with a side of guilt about her unworthiness to receive it. "Tell me about her," she said as they shared the simple meal. "My grandmother. Is she really as you described her, or were you just telling me what you thought I needed to hear?" Jacob chewed thoughtfully before answering. "She's old. Older than the rocks, it seems sometimes. Her hands shake when she tries to do fine work, and her voice isn't as strong as it used to be. But her mind," he shook his head in wonder. "Her mind is like a knife that's been sharpened so many times it can cut through anything. She sees things, Ayana. Dreams things. Knows things that haven't happened yet, and remembers things that the rest of us have forgotten. And she really sent you to find me?" "She did. But not for the reasons you might think." Jacob poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. "She didn't send me because she missed you, though she does. She didn't send me because she wanted to rescue you from the mission, though she knew what that place was doing to you. She sent me because she saw something in her dreams, something that's coming." Ayana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. "What kind of something?" "Change," Jacob said simply. "Big change. The kind that sweeps across the land like wildfire, burning away everything that came before and leaving space for something new to grow." She saw the old ways dying and the new ways not yet born. She saw a time when people like us, people who carry multiple worlds inside them, would be needed to help build bridges between what was and what will be. He looked directly at her, and in the firelight his eyes seemed to hold depth she hadn't noticed before. "She saw you, Ayana. Not the broken woman the mission tried to make you, but the healer you were always meant to become. She saw you speaking words that could heal not just bodies, but the wounds between peoples. She saw you using both the old medicine and the new, weaving them together into something stronger than either could be alone. The necklace he had shown her at the mission, silver and turquoise, interwoven with Christian symbols and Apache designs, suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a roadmap, a vision of what she might become if she could learn to embrace all the parts of herself, instead of allowing them to war against each other. And if she's wrong? Ayanna asked. If I'm not what she saw in her dreams? If I'm just a broken woman who's forgotten too much of who she used to be? Jacob reached across the small space between them and touched her hand, his fingers warm and calloused and utterly without judgment. Then you'll figure out who you really are, one day at a time, one choice at a time. That's what the rest of us do. The fire burned lower as the night deepened around them. In the distance, Ayanna could hear the soft hoot of an owl, the skitter of small creatures moving through the brush, the whisper of wind through stone. These were sounds she had heard from her room at the mission, but muffled by walls and windows and the weight of her captivity. Out here, they were clear and immediate, and full of life. I can hear them, she said wonderingly. Hear what? Everything. The desert. It's not empty at all, is it? It's full of voices, full of life. I just couldn't hear them before because I was locked away from them. Jacob nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The mission tried to teach you that the natural world was something to be feared, controlled, kept at a distance. But your grandmother's people know better. They know that we're part of it all, the rocks and the water and the wind and the animals. Separated from us, and we start to die inside. As if to underscore his words, a coyote called from somewhere in the darkness beyond the canyon walls. The sound was wild and free and utterly unashamed of itself, and it made something deep in Ayanna's chest answer with a longing so fierce it nearly brought tears to her eyes. I want to learn, she said, and the words came out with more force than she had intended. I want to remember what I've forgotten and learn what I never knew. I want to understand what my grandmother saw in her dreams. Then we'd better get some sleep, Jacob said, banking the fire so that it would burn low through the night. Tomorrow we start climbing into the high country, and it's going to be a hard ride. As they settled into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the dying fire, Ayanna found herself staring up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. The stars were brighter than she had ever seen them, so numerous and so close that she felt she could reach up and pluck them like flowers. For the first time in 18 years, she fell asleep without the sound of mission bells marking the hours, without gray walls pressing in around her, without the weight of someone else's expectations crushing down on her chest. She fell asleep to the song of the desert night, and in her dreams she heard her grandmother's voice calling her home. Dawn came to the hidden canyon like a whispered secret, touching the rim of the rock walls with fingers of rose and gold, before spilling down into the shadows where Ayanna lay wrapped in her blanket. She woke not to the harsh clang of mission bells, but to the liquid song of a mockingbird perched on the canyon wall above them, its voice cycling through a dozen different melodies, as if it couldn't decide which one best captured the beauty of the morning. Jacob was already awake, crouched beside the stream with his hat off, washing his face in water so clear she could see every pebble on the bottom. His dark hair hung loose around his shoulders, and in the gentle morning light he looked younger somehow, less like the dangerous gunslinger who had faced down Father McKinnon, and more like a man finding peace in simple rituals. Sleep well? He asked without turning around, as if he had sensed her watching him. Better than I have in years, she replied honestly. The hard ground should have been uncomfortable compared to her narrow mission cot, but something about sleeping under the open sky had relaxed muscles she hadn't realized were permanently tensed. How did you know I was awake? Your breathing changed. He stood and turned toward her, water dripping from his face. his eyes already scanning the canyon rim with the automatic wariness of a man who had survived by never taking safety for granted. Also, you talk in your sleep, in Apache. Ayanna felt heat rise in her cheeks. What did I say? Jacob's mouth quirked into something that might have been a smile. Mostly you were arguing with someone about the proper way to prepare healing herbs. Very passionate argument. I think you won. Despite her embarrassment, Ayanna found herself laughing, a sound so rusty from disuse that it surprised them both. When had she last laughed? When had she last felt light enough for laughter to rise naturally from her chest, instead of being something she had to manufacture for the benefit of others? We should move soon, Jacob said, the moment of levity passing, as he began to break camp with efficient movements. The men from town won't give up easy, and they know this country better than I'd like. As if summoned by his words, the sound of distant voices echoed off the canyon walls. Faint, distorted by the stone maze that surrounded them, but definitely human and definitely getting closer. Jacob froze, his hand dropping instinctively to his gun belt. How many? Ayanna whispered, though she couldn't have said why she was whispering. Jacob tilted his head, listening with the focused intensity of a predator evaluating prey. 4, maybe 5. On foot now must have left their horses at the canyon mouth. His expression darkened. They're good. Better than I expected small-town vigilantes to be. What do? We run. Jacob was already throwing gear into saddlebags, his movements quick but controlled. This canyon has a back way out, but it's narrow. We'll have to lead the horse through on foot. Ayanna rolled her blanket with hands that trembled only slightly. The fear was there. How could it not be? But it was different from the fear she had lived with at the mission. This was clean fear, honest fear, the kind that sharpened your senses and made you feel more alive rather than less. This was the fear of a hunted animal, not the fear of a caged one. They made it perhaps 100 yards along the narrow back trail before the first shot rang out. The bullet struck stone inches from Ayanna's head, sending chips of sandstone flying, and filling the air with the sharp crack of gunpowder and the whine of ricocheting lead. Jacob threw himself sideways, tackling her to the ground behind a fallen boulder while his paint mare danced nervously at the end of her lead rope. Stay down, Jacob hissed, drawing his pistol with fluid grace. Don't move, don't make a sound, don't even breathe loud. But even as he spoke, Ayanna could hear boots scrambling over rock, voices calling out directions, the metallic click of weapons being cocked and ready to fire. Their pursuers had found the back trail faster than Jacob had hoped, and now they were trapped in a passage barely wide enough for one person, with armed men closing in from behind and only narrow stone walls on either side. Jacob Thorne. The voice that echoed off the canyon walls was rough with tobacco and years of shouting over cattle and wind. We know you're in there, breed. Send out the squaw, and maybe we let you ride away. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. Ayanna could see him calculating distances, angles, possibilities. His eyes had gone flat and cold, and she realized she was seeing the part of him that had earned his reputation with a gun, the part that could kill, without hesitation when killing was what the situation required. What's it gonna be, Thorne? Another voice, younger, but just as hard. You gonna die for some used-up mission whore, or you gonna be smart about this? The words hit Ayanna like physical blows, but they also sparked something else, a flame of anger that burned away, the last remnants of the fear she had carried from her captivity. Used up, mission whore. The casual cruelty of men who saw women like her as things to be used and discarded, their value measured only by their utility to men's desires. Ayanna, Jacob whispered urgently, when I tell you to run, you take the horse and you go. Don't look back, don't wait for me, just run. The trail leads up and out, follow it north until you find the main road, then head for the mountains. I'm not leaving you. You are. His voice carried absolute authority. This is what I do, what I've always done. You have something more important to do than die in this canyon." Before she could argue, the shooting started in earnest. Bullets whined off stone all around them as Jacob rose from behind their meager cover and returned. Fire with precision that spoke of long practice and natural talent. But there were too many of them, and they had all the advantages of position and numbers. For every shot Jacob fired, 3 came back at them, chipping away at the boulder that protected them, filling the air with stone dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. "Now," Jacob shouted, "go." But Ayanna didn't run. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone present, including herself. She began to sing. The words came from some place deeper than memory, older than fear, more ancient than the stones that surrounded them. They poured out of her throat in a voice that was stronger than it had been since the day Father McKinnon had burned her with the iron, clearer than it had been since the morning she first learned to be afraid of her own power. Shashbija, Nehi Wigai Yatsi. Bear walking, little white lightning ... It was a war song. One of the old ones, the kind her grandfather had sung when he rode with Geronimo in the days when the Apache still believed they could fight the tide of white settlement and win. But it was more than a song, it was a calling, a summoning, a bridge between the world of flesh and the world of spirit. The men shooting at them faltered as the sound echoed off the canyon walls, amplified and transformed by the stone, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Human voices weren't supposed to carry that much power, weren't supposed to make the very air vibrate with authority and ancient knowledge. And then the canyon answered her call. It started as a rumble, so deep it was felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself. Jacob looked around wildly, his gunfighter's instincts screaming that something was wrong. Something was happening that didn't fit any pattern he understood. The rumble grew louder, became a roar, became the sound of stone moving in ways stone was never meant to move. High above them, where the canyon walls narrowed to a thin slot of sky, rocks began to shift and tumble. Small ones at first, pebbles and chips that had been loosened by years of wind and rain, and the slow, patient work of roots growing in impossible places. But then larger stones joined the avalanche, and larger ones still, until the entire canyon wall was moving in a slow-motion cascade of destruction that would block the narrow passage completely. Yan Sani, Ayanna called to the canyon walls, her voice carrying impossible distances. "Thank you, Grandmother Stone." The shooting had stopped entirely now. Through the gaps in the falling rock, she could hear shouts of panic. Men scrambling for safety as tons of sandstone came crashing down where they had been standing moments before. The dust cloud that rose from the collapse was thick enough to choke on, but it also provided perfect cover. Jacob stared at her with something that might have been awe or might have been terror. What did you?" "I asked the stone spirits for help," Ayanna said simply, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Sometimes they say yes." They climbed out of the canyon in silence, broken only by the occasional rumble of settling rock behind them. When they finally emerged onto the rim, the desert stretched out before them in an endless expanse of red stone and blue sky, beautiful and terrible and completely indifferent to the small human dramas played out in its shadows. Jacob helped her mount the horse, but his hand shook slightly as he did so. "In all my years," he said quietly, "I've never seen anything like that. My grandmother used to say that the land remembers everything, every song ever sung to it, every prayer ever offered, every drop of blood ever spilled on its stones." Ayanna settled into the saddle, feeling more at home on horseback now than she ever had in a mission pew. She said that if you knew how to ask properly, the land would help you. But only if your cause was just. They rode hard for the rest of the morning, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the blocked canyon. By noon, they had climbed high enough that the air grew thin and sharp, and the landscape began to change from red desert to pine-covered mountains dotted with aspens that flashed gold and silver in the wind. "Are you afraid of me now?" Ayanna asked as they paused to rest the horse beside a mountain stream. Jacob considered the question seriously, turning it over in his mind like a man examining a gem for flaws. "Maybe a little," he admitted finally. "But not the way you think. I'm not afraid of your power. I've seen enough of the world to know that there are more things in it than most people want to believe. I'm afraid of what that power might cost you." "What do you mean?" "Men like those who were chasing us, they'll tell stories about what happened in that canyon. Stories about the Apache witch who could bring down mountains with her voice. Those stories will spread, grow in the telling, become legends. And legends have a way of attracting the wrong kind of attention." Ayanna felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She had spent 18 years hiding her gifts, suppressing them, pretending they didn't exist. The idea of having them exposed to the world, of becoming the subject of stories and speculation and fear, was almost more terrifying than the bullets that had been flying around their heads that morning. "Maybe," she said slowly, "it's time to stop hiding. Maybe it's time to let people see what Apache medicine can really do." Jacob smiled, and this time there was no shadow of worry in the expression. "Your grandmother is going to like you even more than she already does." As they rode deeper into the mountains, following trails that seemed to exist more in memory than in any physical reality, Ayanna found herself thinking about the song that had come out of her in the canyon. She had no memory of learning it, no recollection of anyone teaching her the words or the melody. But it had been there when she needed it, rising from some deep well of ancestral knowledge that Father McKinnon had tried to poison but had never quite managed to kill. How much more was buried down there? How many other songs? How many other ceremonies? How many other ways of speaking to the world that the mission had tried to make her forget? Tomorrow, if Jacob was right, she would begin to find out. Tomorrow she would meet the grandmother who had sent a gunslinger across the desert to bring her home. Tonight, she would sleep under stars that seemed close enough to whisper to, in air that tasted of pine and freedom and the promise of everything she had never dared to dream she might become. The mountain trail wound higher as the day wore on, switchbacking through stands of pine and aspen that whispered secrets in the wind. The air grew thinner with each mile, sharp and clean in a way that made Ayanna's lungs work harder, but also made her feel more alive than she had in years. This was the country of her birth. She realized not these specific peaks and valleys, but this kind of landscape where stone met sky and the earth reached upward towards something greater than itself, had grown quieter as they climbed, his eyes constantly scanning the forest around them with an alertness that went beyond simple caution. There was something else in his bearing now, a tension that spoke of approaching something significant, something that would demand more from both of them than the simple act of travel. "We're close," he said finally, as they crested a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. "Your grandmother's people make their winter camp in a canyon about 5 miles ahead. But before we go down there, there's something you need to understand." Ayanna studied his face, noting the way his jaw had tightened, the way his hands gripped the reins with unnecessary force. What kind of something? Jacob dismounted and helped her down from the horse, then led the animal to a small clearing where it could graze on the mountain grass that grew in sparse patches between the trees. When he turned back to her, his expression was grave in a way that made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "Your grandmother isn't the only one who's been waiting for you," he said. "There are others in the band who remember you, who knew your mother, and not all of them are as forgiving as she is about the choices that were made 18 years ago." The words hit Ayanna like cold water thrown in her face. In all her imaginings of this reunion, she had pictured herself being welcomed home like a long-lost daughter, embraced by people who understood her struggles and celebrated her survival. The idea that some of her own people might judge her, might find her wanting, had never occurred to her. "What do you mean, forgiving?" she asked, though part of her already knew what he was going to say. Jacob sat down on a fallen log and gestured for her to join him. The afternoon sun slanted through the pine needles above them, painting patterns of light and shadow across his weathered features. Your mother's decision to give you to the mission, it wasn't supported by everyone in the band. There were those who believed she should have kept you, should have risked the dangers of raising a child with such powerful gifts, rather than sending you away to be changed by the white world. Ayanna felt something cold settle in her chest. They think she betrayed our people by giving me away. Some do. And by extension, they think you betrayed them by staying away so long, by allowing yourself to be shaped by mission teachings, by not trying harder to find your way back to the people. The unfairness of it took her breath away. How could they blame her for choices made when she was 8 years old? How could they fault her for surviving the only way she knew how, for making the best of an impossible situation? But even as the anger rose in her throat, another part of her mind, the part that had been trained by 18 years of mission, life to examine her own soul for evidence of sin, began to whisper its own accusations. Hadn't she accepted the safety of mission walls while her people struggled and starved on the reservations? Hadn't she worn Christian clothing and spoken Christian prayers while Apache children were being taken from their families and sent to boarding schools designed to kill the Indian in them? Hadn't she, in some deep way, chosen comfort over courage, survival over solidarity? There's more, Jacob continued, his voice gentle but implacable. Your gifts, the power you've always carried, it marks you as someone special among the people. Medicine women, healers, those who can speak to the spirits, they hold positions of great honor, but also great responsibility. Some in the band believe that by allowing the mission to suppress your gifts for so many years, you've weakened them, corrupted them with white man's religion. And what do you believe? Ayanna asked, surprised by how much his answer mattered. To her, Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the valley below where shadows were beginning to gather as the sun moved toward the western peaks. I believe, he said finally, that gifts like yours don't get weaker from being suppressed. They get stronger, like a river that's been dammed. And I believe that sometimes the spirits work in ways we don't expect, through experiences we wouldn't choose for ourselves. He turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes serious but not unkind. You've lived in both worlds, Ayanna. You know things about the white man's ways that none of your grandmother's people know. You've seen their medicine work alongside your own. Maybe that's not corruption. Maybe that's preparation for something none of us can see yet. The words echoed what he had told her before about the prophecies, about the changes coming to the world, about the need for people who could build bridges between different ways of being. But hearing it now, with the reality of her homecoming just hours away, the weight of expectation felt almost crushing. What if I disappoint them? She asked, voicing the fear that had been growing inside her chest like a tumor. What if I'm not what they remember, not what they hope I've become? What if 18 years in the mission has changed me too much to ever truly belong with the people again? Jacob reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and steady against her palm. Then you'll figure out how to belong anyway. That's what people like us do. We make our own place in the world when the world doesn't have a ready-made place for us. As if to underscore his words, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the canyon walls with wild, untamed beauty. Ayanna watched the bird soar on currents invisible to human eyes, perfectly at home in the vast space between earth and sky, belonging neither to the solid world below nor the ethereal realm above, but somehow complete in its betweenness. Tell me about her, Ayanna said. My grandmother. What's she really like? Not the mystical figure from the prophecies, but the woman herself. Jacob smiled, and for the first time since they had begun this conversation, the expression reached his eyes. She's stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery. She'll argue with you about everything from the proper way to prepare picky bread to whether the morning star rises in the right direction. She has opinions about things that haven't been invented yet. Despite her nervousness, Ayanna found herself laughing. She sounds like someone I'd like to meet. She's also the kindest person I've ever known, Jacob continued. And the strongest. She survived the long walk, the reservation years, the cavalry raids, the boarding schools that took her own children. She's buried 3 husbands and half her children, and she still gets up every morning and finds reasons to be grateful for another day. The long walk, Ayanna had heard whispers of it at the mission, fragments of stories about the forced relocation of Apache people to the Bosque Redondo reservation in New Mexico. Hundreds of miles of desert crossed on foot, families separated, children dying along the way, a whole way of life uprooted and transplanted to soil where it couldn't survive. She was there? Ayanna asked. During the long walk? Jacob nodded. Grimly, she was about your age when it happened. Saw her first husband shot down by soldiers, saw her baby daughter die of fever on the trail. But she survived, and when the government finally admitted the reservation was a disaster and allowed some of the people to return to Arizona, she was one of the ones who made it back. The magnitude of her grandmother's survival suddenly hit Ayanna like a physical blow. Here she was, worrying about whether she would be accepted by people who had endured losses beyond her imagination, people who had faced extinction and chosen to continue existing anyway. What right did she have to fear their judgment when they had faced horrors that made her 18 years of mission life look like a minor inconvenience? I'm being selfish, aren't I? She said quietly. Worrying about my own reception when they've been through so much worse. You're being human, Jacob replied, and that's exactly what you need to be when you meet them. Not some perfect symbol of Apache womanhood, not some mystical bridge between worlds, just a human being who's been hurt and who's trying to heal. They'll understand that better than you think. A sound from the forest below them made Jacob's head snap up, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. But after a moment, his posture relaxed and he smiled. They know we're here, he said. Ayanna followed his gaze and saw them. 3 figures moving through the trees below with the fluid grace of people who had been born to this landscape. Even at a distance, even through the shifting shadows of the forest, she could see that they moved differently than white men, differently than the Spanish traders who had sometimes visited the mission. They moved like part of the forest itself, like extensions of wind and shadow and dappled light. Your grandmother's scouts, Jacob explained. They've been tracking us since we entered the valley. Probably since yesterday, if I'm being honest. They're good enough that I never saw them. One of the figures below raised a hand in what might have been greeting or signal, and Jacob responded with a complex gesture that involved both hands and seemed to convey information Ayanna couldn't interpret. What did you tell them? She asked. That we come in peace, that we bring someone they've been waiting for, and that we're ready to be welcomed or challenged, whatever they think is appropriate. The figures below conferred among themselves for a moment, then began moving up the slope toward them. As they drew closer, Ayanna could make out more details: 2 men and a woman, all dressed in a mixture of traditional Apache clothing and practical modifications that spoke of lives lived in hiding, in constant movement, in the spaces between the white world and the old world. The woman reached them first, and Ayanna's breath caught in her throat. She was perhaps 40 years old, with silver threading through her black hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter as much as hardship. But it was her face that made Ayanna's heart race, the high cheekbones, the shape of her eyes, the way she held her chin when she was thinking. Yat, Shiche, the woman said to Jacob, her voice carrying the musical cadence of Apache spoken by someone who had never learned to be ashamed of it. Then she turned to Ayanna, and her expression shifted to something softer, more complex. Yati, Shijayas, she said. Hello, my child. Ayana felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. It had been 18 years since anyone had called her child in Apache. 18 years since she had heard the language spoken with such natural authority, such unquestioned belonging. Yadi Shima, she replied, the words coming out. Rusty but recognizable. Hello, my mother. The woman stepped closer, studying Ayana's face with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile memory with reality. Finally, she reached out and touched the scar on Ayana's throat, her fingers gentle, but her eyes blazing with an anger that made the air around them seem to crackle. They marked you, she said, switching to English that carried only the faintest trace of accent. The holy men mark you like they mark their cattle. I survived, Ayana replied, unsure what else to say. Yes, the woman agreed. You survived. The question now is whether you remember how to live. She stepped back and nodded to the two men who had accompanied her. I am Desba, daughter of Maria Santos, sister to your mother Elena, your grandmother. Is waiting. She has been patient for 18 years, but patience has its limits, even for her. As they prepared to descend into the valley where her grandmother's people waited, Ayana felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders. Like a mantle. She was no longer simply a runaway from the mission, no longer just a woman trying to escape her past. She was Ayana, granddaughter of a medicine woman, carrier of gifts that had been tested by fire and suppression, someone who might be a bridge between worlds or might be a disappointment too painful to bear. Either way, she was about to find out which. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson as they began their descent toward a reckoning 18 years in the making. The Apache camp nestled in the valley, like a secret the mountains had kept for generations. Traditional wickiups stood alongside modern canvas tents. Cookfires sent spirals of aromatic smoke into the evening air, and the sound of children's laughter mixed with the low voices of adults conducting the eternal business of survival. It was smaller than Ayana had imagined, perhaps 40 people in total, but there was something about the way they moved through their space that spoke of deep roots, of belonging so complete it needed no announcement. As Desba led them down the narrow trail into the heart of the camp, faces turned toward them with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion, to something that might have been hope. Ayana felt the weight of their gazes like physical pressure, each pair of eyes measuring her against memories and expectations. She couldn't possibly know. An old man emerged from one of the larger wickiups, his white hair braided with strips of red cloth, his face a map of every season he had witnessed in these mountains. His eyes, when they fixed on Ayana, held depths that seemed to contain entire conversations. Hastian Yazi, Desba said respectfully, using the formal address. For an elder. This is Ayana, daughter of Elena, granddaughter of our medicine woman. She has come home to us. The old man studied Ayana for a long moment, his gaze taking in everything. The mission-made dress she still wore, the way she held herself like someone expecting punishment, the scar on her throat that marked her as someone who had been broken and mended. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the authority that came with having outlived most of his generation. She has come back to us, he corrected gently. Whether she has come home remains to be seen. The words stung, but Ayana forced herself to meet his eyes steadily. She had endured 18 years of Father McKinnon's judgment. She could endure this as well. She Iea Ani Inashai, she said, her Apache rusty but clear. I am called Ayana. I have traveled far to stand before my people and learn whether there is still a place for me among them. A murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered around them. Someone, a middle-aged woman with intelligent eyes, nodded approvingly at Ayana's use of the formal speech patterns. Others whispered among themselves in voices too low for her to catch the words, but not too low for her to sense the judgment being passed. Your grandmother is in the medicine lodge, Hastian Yazi said finally. She has been preparing for this meeting since the day you were taken from us. Whether you are ready for it, He shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the uncertainty that surrounded homecomings and second chances. Desba touched Ayana's shoulder gently. Come, it's time. The medicine lodge stood apart from the other structures, built in the traditional way with willow branches and covered with hides that had been painted with symbols Ayana recognized but couldn't quite interpret. Smoke rose from an opening in the center, carrying the scent of sage and sweetgrass and something else, something that smelled like memory itself. At the entrance, Desba paused. She is old, Ayana. Older than the stones, older than the wind, but her spirit. She smiled, and for the first time since they had met, the expression was entirely warm. Her spirit is younger than yours. Remember that when you see her. Jacob squeezed Ayana's hand once, a gesture of support and farewell. This part you have to do alone, he said softly. But remember, you're not the same person who left 18 years ago. You're not the same person who left the mission 3 days ago. You're exactly who you need to be in this moment. Ayana nodded, though her throat felt too tight for words. She ducked through the entrance of the medicine lodge and stepped into a world she had almost forgotten existed. The interior was lit by a small fire that cast dancing shadows on the curved walls. Bundles of herbs hung from the framework, their scents weaving together into something that was both medicine and prayer. And there, sitting cross-legged beside the fire with a blanket draped over her shoulders, was the woman who had sent a gunslinger across the desert to bring her granddaughter home. She was ancient. That was Ayana's first thought, looking at the deeply lined face, the white hair that hung in long braids, the hands that were gnarled with arthritis but still moved with surprising grace as they tended the fire. She looked like she had been carved from the desert itself, weathered by wind and sun and time until she had become something elemental, eternal. But her eyes were bright as stars, sharp as obsidian blades, alive with an intelligence that made her seem younger than anyone Ayana had ever met. Yat Shitsue, the old woman said, using the word for granddaughter with such tenderness that Ayana felt tears spring to her eyes. You are taller than I expected, and sadder, but also stronger, much stronger than the child who was taken from us. Ayana wanted to run to her, to throw herself into those ancient arms and sob out 18 years of loneliness and pain and confusion. But something held her back, maybe respect, maybe fear, maybe the simple recognition that this moment was too important to be rushed. Yat Shimasani, she replied, the formal address for grandmother feeling strange on her tongue. After so many years, I don't know if I should be here. I don't know if I belong here anymore. The old woman, her grandmother, she had to start thinking of her as family rather than as some mystical figure studied her with those impossible eyes. Sit, she said simply. We have much to discuss, you and I, 18 years worth of words that need to be spoken. Ayana settled herself on the blanket across the fire from her grandmother, trying to mirror the older woman's posture. The flames danced between them, creating a barrier of light and warmth that somehow made the space feel both intimate and sacred. You are afraid, her grandmother observed. It wasn't a question. Yes. Good. Fear means you understand that this matters. Fear means you care about the outcome. The old woman reached into a pouch beside her and withdrew a handful of something that she sprinkled on the fire. The flames flared blue and green, and the scent of cedar filled the lodge. Now tell me, what did they do to your voice? The question was so direct, so unflinchingly honest, that Ayana found herself answering before she could think to deflect or minimize. They tried to kill it. They said it was the devil's voice, that speaking Apache was a sin against God. They beat me when I used the old words. They burned my throat when I sang the old songs. But they didn't succeed. Again, not a question. No, they didn't succeed. Her grandmother smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. Of course they didn't. You are my granddaughter. Child of my child, carrier of gifts that have been passed down through generations of medicine women. Did you think a few white men with their iron tools and their small god could destroy what the Creator himself placed in your throat? I thought. For a long time, I thought maybe they were right. Maybe my gifts were evil, corrupted, something to be ashamed of. And now? Ayanna thought of the canyon, of the song that had risen from her throat without conscious thought, of the stones that had answered her call and protected them from their pursuers. Now I think they were afraid of something they couldn't understand. Or control, wisdom, her grandmother said approvingly. It took you 18 years to learn it, but wisdom nonetheless. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them, the weight of years and separation beginning to ease. Finally, her grandmother spoke again. The young man who brought you Jacob Thorne, you trust him, I do. Good. Trust is a gift, not given lightly. He has walked between worlds longer than you have, carried the burden of mixed blood in a world that wants everyone to choose sides. He understands the weight you carry. Is it true what he told me? About the prophecies, about changes coming, about people like us being needed to build bridges? Her grandmother's eyes seemed to look through her, beyond her, into possibilities that Ayanna couldn't see. The world is changing, child. The old ways and the new ways are crashing together like two rivers meeting, and in the turbulence, much will be lost, but much will also be born. You have lived in both worlds, you know the white man's medicine and the Apache way. You understand their language and ours, their healing and ours. She leaned forward, her ancient hands reaching out to cup Ayanna's face with surprising gentleness. You are what I have prayed for, a bridge that cannot be burned, a voice that speaks in all tongues, a healer who can work with any medicine that serves life rather than death. What if I fail? What if I'm not strong enough, wise enough, good enough for what you need me to be? Then you will learn to be stronger, wiser, better. That's what living means, child, becoming more than you were yesterday, one choice at a time, one breath at a time. Her grandmother released her face and reached behind her, bringing out something wrapped in soft doeskin. This was your mother's, she said, unfolding the leather to reveal a medicine pouch worked with intricate beadwork and patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. She wore it the day she gave you to the mission. She made me promise to give it to you when you came home. Ayanna took the pouch with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the sacred objects, inside stones and herbs and small bones that hummed with power even through the leather. She knew I would come back. She hoped. We all hoped. But hope and knowing are different things, and hope was all we had for 18 years. I'm sorry, Ayanna whispered, the words coming out broken and raw. I'm sorry I stayed away so long. I'm sorry I let them change me. I'm sorry I forgot so much of who I was supposed to be. Her grandmother's voice, when it came, was fierce with love and pride. You survived, child. You survived 18 years in a place designed to kill everything beautiful about you. And you came out with your gifts intact, your spirit unbroken, your heart still capable of love. Never apologize for surviving. Outside the lodge, the sounds of the camp had settled into the rhythms of evening, children being called to sleep, adults gathering around fires to share the day's stories, the soft sounds of people living there. Lives in freedom. Ayanna could hear Jacob's voice among the others, probably answering questions about their journey, their escape, the changes happening in the world beyond the mountains. Will they accept me? She asked. The others? I know some of them question whether I belong here. Some will. Others won't. That's their choice to make, just as staying or leaving is yours. But remember, this belonging isn't something other people give you. It's something you create through your actions, your choices, your commitment to being part of something larger than yourself. Her grandmother stood with the careful movements of someone whose bones carried the weight of many. Winters and Ayanna rose as well. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, but the lodge still felt warm, still felt like a sanctuary. "There will be a ceremony tomorrow night," her grandmother said. "A welcoming ceremony, if you choose to stay. If you choose to take your place among the people, not as the child who was taken away, but as the woman who chose to come home. And if I stay, what then? Then you learn. You remember what you forgot, you discover what you never knew, and you figure out how to use all of it, the mission learning and the Apache wisdom, the white man's medicine and the old healing ways to serve life wherever you find it." They stood together in the doorway of the lodge, looking out at the camp where Ayana's people continued the ancient work of living, surviving, maintaining their culture in a world that wanted to erase them. The stars overhead were brilliant in the thin mountain air, countless points of light scattered across the darkness like seeds of possibility. "Ahehi, Shimasani," Ayana said, the Apache words for thank you. Grandmother feeling more natural on her tongue than they had in 18 years. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for sending Jacob to find me. Thank you for keeping a place for me here. Thank you for being brave enough to claim it," her grandmother replied. "Now go. Jacob is probably wondering if we dissolved you in the fire and smoke. And the people want to hear your voice, your real voice, the one that speaks all languages and calls stones from the sky." As Ayana walked back toward the main camp, she felt something settling in her chest that she had never experienced before. Not the desperate gratitude of someone granted sanctuary, not the careful compliance of someone trying to earn their place, but the deep, quiet certainty of someone who had finally found where they belonged. Tomorrow she would begin the real work of building bridges between worlds, of learning to be the healer and teacher and voice that her grandmother's prophecies had foreseen. Tonight, she would sit by a fire with her people, speak in the language of her birth, and remember what it felt like to use her sacred voice without fear, without shame, without apology. The stars above seemed to pulse with approval, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, wild and free and completely unashamed of the sound it made in the darkness. Ayana smiled and answered back, her voice lifting in the night air like a prayer finally given permission to be heard. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.